Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Guide, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. Today, I want to talk about the trap of getting back to normal. Now, we all want to get back to normal. We're all sick and tired of COVID 19, pardon the pun, and this is something that causes us to rush to reopen, causes companies to rush to reopen, causes people to try to go back to public life. This is something that we all want to do. We really want to get back there to normal life. Unfortunately, there's a pretty bad trap there. And this trap is something that we're all rushing headlong into, folks who are reopening, as states are reimposing restrictions. They're not realizing that what we're facing is waves of restrictions and reopenings. And these waves are causing people to lose a lot of money who are rushing to reopen their companies. They're really suffering right now, where in many states that are reimposing restrictions, causing shutdowns, and causing people to not spend money that a lot of companies think they're going to be spending because people are scared, people are worried, and they're not eager to go back to normal in a way that companies are thinking about and many professionals and leaders are thinking about. In order to understand what drives us to make bad decisions around this rush to get back to normal, I want to take us back to the start of the pandemic when a lot of companies were making some pretty bad decisions that are in many ways similar to the bad decisions that they're making right now. So, there was a startup that I want to share about, and which the case study that I know about, it was a 90 people startup. It's a technology startup, and it was trying to make decisions at the start of the pandemic about what to do. And you know what? It thought that the pandemic wouldn't be a big deal, as so many companies didn't think the pandemic would be a big deal. They thought, the leadership of the company, at least the C-suite, they thought the pandemic would blow over soon. It would be over in a couple of weeks, maybe a month at most. But as a result, they held off on making the major decisions to adapt to the pandemic, to think about the long-term future of the situation. Unfortunately, they were following some pretty important business leaders in doing so, most notably Elon Musk. He tweeted on March 6, 2020, that the coronavirus pandemic is dumb as it was spreading in the United States, making many people sick. And of course, he tweeted on March 19th, after the declaration of the pandemic as a national emergency, he tweeted that based on current trends, there will be probably close to zero new cases of the pandemic by the end of April. And of course, he was very wrong there. And the company listened to him. The technology leaders, Elon Musk is a prominent entrepreneur, they're an entrepreneurial company, then that's a great startup, and they listened to him. But they made a serious mistake in listening to him. And soon they realized that they fell into this trap and they started arguing with each other, blaming each other. There were mutual recriminations. It was a pretty bad situation. So at that point, Tim, who was the CFO of the startup, he was familiar with my work on how addressing this new abnormal. He knew I wrote a book about this called Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the Coronavirus of Pandemic. And so he knew I was working on this topic and he gave me a call, asked me what to do. Well, I talked to them, the C-suite, the CEO, Tim, the CFO, and as well as the COO, and told them that we really need to face the truth of this new abnormal. Many companies are still refusing to do it, even like their company was refusing to do it at first. They failed to realize the truth that COVID-19 is a major disruption. It's not a short-term emergency as so many people think. It will not magically, miraculously disappear one day out of nowhere as so many people think. This is a major disruption, and it made our world very different from the world that was there before COVID-19. And we have to realize that, and we have to plan for the long-term future. We have to realize it will not go away anytime soon, and that so many people, including Tim's company, a tech startup, was making some pretty bad decisions around the situation. Now, we make bad decisions around COVID-19 due to dangerous judgment errors in our minds, the way our brain is wired. Now, cognitive neuroscience and behavioral economics, this is what the research shows, that we face dangerous judgment errors called cognitive biases, and this is the area where I'm an expert. And they come from a combination of our evolutionary background, of evolutionary psychology, so how we evolved to be where we are, and the current structure of our brain, so how our brain is wired. Those are the two factors that cause these cognitive biases. The biggest one relating to the pandemic, what so many companies fell into and are still falling into, is called the normalcy bias. Now, we tend to see the short-term and medium-term future as being mainly informed by the past, being much like the past. And it was a safe assumption in the evolutionary environment for what we're wired for, the ancient savannah, when we lived in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people. The major changes were the seasons, the turning of the seasons. Our life in the future would be much more like our life in the past. But that's not a safe assumption right now. We should not assume that everything will keep going normally, because our current world is full of major disruptions. Whether technology-based disruptions, and that's a major issue, so lots of technology-based disruptions, whether the fiscal crisis, human-caused problems like the 2009 fiscal crisis, or this natural-caused crises like the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic. We make bad assumptions, bad decisions about it, and we, as a result, underestimate the likelihood and the impact of major disruptions. So that is something that I told Tim, I told the CEO, I told the COO, and they had some trouble accepting it. So we had to have a couple of calls before we talked it through. But then eventually they realized the validity of my statements, and we made a long-term plan for the company that involved a serious pivot, because they were not heading in the right direction, because they just kept going again previously like they were previously going. So we use the Defend Your Future technique, which is an excellent technique developed by my research to inform us in going to the future and making good decisions about how we will make a strategic plan for the long-term future. So first, we established the scope and goals of what they wanted to evaluate. And they wanted to evaluate the next 3 years, what's going on in the next 3 years. Then we gathered stakeholders. In this case, just the 3 of them. We didn't go beyond them because they weren't sure about how to communicate about this issue outside the little small group of the top leadership, because there was a lot of conflict and tensions going on within the company beyond that. Then the anticipated future. The ideal future would be that COVID-19 goes away pretty quickly with a vaccine. Of course, vaccine we will not have until early 2021 at the earliest, and that's very optimistic. We'll have an effective vaccine by early 2021. And then, of course, it'll take a lot of time to produce and distribute it, vaccinate people. We have polls, surveys showing that only 50% of the population is willing to take a vaccine. And given how the government has not shown itself to be highly competent in the early stages of the pandemic, I would not be very confident about its ability to manage the production, distribution, and actual vaccination of people effectively. So we're assuming right now that people will not be widely vaccinated until early 2022 in the most optimistic scenario. It'll take maybe about a year for that to happen. And that's pretty optimistic given the kind of opposition, government incompetence that we're likely to face with producing vaccine, distributing the vaccine widely, and vaccinating people. So early 2022, that's the anticipated future. That's the ideal future that we can face. Then unanticipated problems. Well, what kind of problems might happen? First of all, vaccine might not be effective. The initial wave of vaccines, we know that right now COVID-19 is mutating in some ways, and the initial wave of vaccines is based on the initial mutation, the initial variation of COVID-19 that came about. So given that COVID-19 is mutating, it's possible that the initial wave of vaccines will not be effective against some of the mutated strains, and we know that at least one of the mutated strains is more prevalent, is spreading faster than the original strain. So it can be not very good to have vaccines against the original strain that might not be effective against the new strain. That can be an anticipated problem, and that's something that we talked about as part of the plan for the tech startup. Another aspect of the problem is that, well, they were having some service interruptions because they provide HR and payroll software, this company, and they were having some service interruptions because they didn't anticipate how bad the hit from COVID-19 would be. And they didn't shut down in a timely enough manner. They didn't have a good plan for shutting down. So they had some service interruptions, and some major clients threatened to cancel. That was really serious. So that can be another series of problems. And there were a number of other problems that we discussed, such as some of their staff who were not very good at working from home, so how are they going to handle that? All those sorts of problems. So problem solving around these. Then unanticipated opportunities. Well, some of the opportunities that they can anticipate might happen is that other companies in their space, they are a pretty entrepreneurial company, and they were more quickly able to pivot. Right now, as a result of our conversation, they were anticipating some serious and quick pivots. But there were other companies in the HR and payroll software space that were not nearly as entrepreneurial. That would find it harder to pivot and serve the needs, adjusted needs of their clients, their B2B clients, of course, that are serving businesses, so that the HR and payroll software would have to be adapted for doing much more virtual interactions, and a lot of their competitors might not pivot as quickly as they would. So those are anticipated opportunities that they can seize market share as a result. We talked about dangerous judgment errors, we talked about the normalcy bias, but there are a whole slew of other dangerous judgment errors, like sunken costs, confirmation bias, loss aversion, and so on, that we talked about that might be relevant to the situation. Then unknown unknowns, what might happen? These are also, you might have heard of them as black swans. So we talked through some unknowns that might occur in combination with COVID-19 that would be exacerbated by COVID-19. So for example, they were located in Texas. So in Texas, of course, there's possibility of hurricanes happening, and that might be an issue. And there was a dust storm coming in from the Sahara that was definitely an issue that might be an unknown that could cause problems. And then communicating and taking next steps. So we talked through their strategic plan for communicating and taking the next steps for conveying this information internally within the company, switching to pretty much all virtual. They decided to retain a few people in the office but greatly decrease their foothold, so they can pay much less, of course, which is definitely a good idea, and have mainly virtual, just have a few people in the office, take care of paperwork and so on. And so, as a result, the company, last time I spoke to Tim, transitioned and was quite successful. They went from struggling to thriving. They resolved their internal conflicts, so that was very good. And they transitioned their team overwhelmingly to remote work, just a couple of people in the office, as I mentioned. And they reached out to reassure their clients. Fortunately, the major ones didn't cancel. They did end up having a couple of clients who were relatively minor cancel, but it wasn't nearly as bad as they were worried about in the first place. So that was a really good transition for them. So that's the trap of getting back to normal in the pandemic, and those are the kind of steps that you need to take to address the normalcy bias and make wise decisions going forward. All right, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Wise Decision Maker Guide, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. You'll check out the blog that's associated with this episode, which will be linked in the comments, so go there, please. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to follow the Wise Decision Maker Guide show through whatever your favorite means of getting this information, of following us. So check those out. Follow us on social media. There are links in the show notes, of course, and get the Wise Decision Maker course. And this is a course, free 8 video-based module course, which is located at disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe. And of course, the link is in the notes. Finally, check out my books around this topic. So I have 2 books, Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic, which of course talks about the pandemic itself and how to address it, and Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, which is more broadly about decision-making, addressing cognitive biases, managing risks, and effective strategic planning. All right, I hope that this episode of the Wise Decision Maker Guide show has been helpful to you for making the wisest and most profitable decisions, my friends.